Senator Hough here for our weekly update from Annapolis. The Maryland General Assembly has reconvened. Last Wednesday we began session, and today I want to talk to you about one of the main issues that Maryland is facing this year, and that is the heroin crisis. Last year we made a number of steps trying to address this crisis. The governor put together a task force, which a number of his recommendations were passed into law. In addition, the state of Maryland passed a Justice Reinvestment Act, which I was very heavily involved in. The long and the short of it is it very much rewrites a lot of our criminal justice laws so that we created a lot of efficiencies, which will create $80 million in savings over the next 10 years. Of that money, the lion's share of it is to go into drug treatment. And I'm a part of that continuing process as I've been named to the oversight board for the Justice Reinvestment Act, which will monitor where that money goes and making sure it goes to treatment facilities that are actually working and helping getting people off of drugs. So those are some of the things that we did last session. This session, I want to talk about a couple things that I'm looking at doing. And just to let you know the scope of this crisis, last year in Frederick County, I represent Frederick and Carroll counties. In Frederick County, there were over 400 calls to the sheriff's office for overdose calls, and then over 100 of those resulted, unfortunately, in heroin deaths. The state of Maryland had over 1,400 heroin deaths last year, and those numbers are somewhat skewed because a lot of our law enforcement have now been outfitted with Narcan, which is a drug which can actually reverse the effects of an overdose and bring someone back to life. So while the number of deaths are higher, they would actually be even higher than that had it not been for the officers being equipped and first responders being equipped with Narcan. So given the scope and the terrible nature of this problem, I want to talk about a couple things that we're looking at addressing this session. First off, on a personal note, I think it's important that education is the first step. So if you're listening to this, make sure that you talk to your grandchildren, your children, that young people, that they're all aware of the awful nature of heroin addiction. And second off, it's important that we bring this issue up in schools as well, that we have to make sure. I know when I was a young person, we had the DARE program. The police officers came in and talked to everybody. So we need to make sure at schools they talk about the awful nature of heroin, because this is really even starting, unfortunately, even in middle schools now. Second is enforcement. Last year, there were some parts of the Justice Reinvestment Act which really hammered those people who were major drug dealers, went after their assets. I'm also heartened by the election of Donald Trump that there will be more border security and stop these drugs from coming across our border. And this year, I'm reintroducing legislation which will increase the penalty for those who are caught illegally selling and trafficking fentanyl. Fentanyl is a deadly combination that they often mix with heroin, which results in many of the overdose deaths, because fentanyl is an extra deadly portion, even more deadly so than heroin, and it's often cut by dealers. Dealers often cut heroin with fentanyl, so we want to target people that sell that. Also, we'll continue to make sure that we increase treatment options for those who are drug addicts, make sure that we have beds available. That's a challenge right now, and as I said, that's something that we're working on. And finally, a lot of people are brought into heroin addiction because they are legally prescribed opioids in the first place. So they're prescribed painkillers for a back surgery or a sports injury, and they end up becoming addicted. And because the cost of legal opioids is so high, they end up going to heroin as a cheaper way to feed their habit. So looking at the prescription of opioids and really the over-prescription of opioids. So making sure that a proper amount is prescribed, making sure that people are warned of the hazards and the dangers of addiction when they are prescribed this, and making sure that, like I talked about earlier, Narcan is available for families and other people who may have a family member who has a heroin addiction. So those are the things that I'm working on this session to really help address and deal with this awful crisis of heroin.